Hey everybody, it's Boo from Mile High Distilling. Today we're going to be finishing up our second part of our Distilling 101 Fermentation Guide. Fun fact on this video, it was recorded about, I'd say a month ago, but I uploaded part one and was pretty quickly found out from your guys' comments that I was basically burning your eye sockets during it. So apologies on that. Everyone who I blinded, be sure to like and subscribe, okay? If you can even see the button, give us one. Leave a comment, give me your eye doctor's number, I'll call him up, I'll make it right, all right? But for now, we gotta finish our part two. Make sure to watch this video before you go to your eye appointment, okay? Now in part one of this video, I really would implore you to watch it if you haven't already. There's gonna be a link to it right here, right here. Haven't really decided, I gotta edit, but you'll see it on your end, okay? Anyways, what we talked about on there was Fermentation 101, very basics, how things started, how fermentation, what it does, mash versus wash, things like that. We would then went on to talk about different fermentation types for making a specific spirit, so vodka, tequila, rums. We went through all that. And then, more to that, we talked about yeast, different types of yeast, down to wait times, and things to look for in your yeast. Now, we have to talk about a few other things. An important thing is going to be, obviously, the equipment. I mean, you're going to need something to ferment in to start with, right? So let's start going over that. When it comes down to size of our fermenter, probably the most common and easiest way you could go about it is just getting a fermenter to scale to your still. If you have an 8-gallon still, you get an 8-gallon fermenter, and so on. Now, when you're thinking of getting your fermenter, there's two things that I would consider paying attention to. It's pretty cut and dry. I mean, really, you can go online, type in fermenter, and any of those choices will probably be something that'll work. You want things to be food grade, probably made out of a polyethylene or glass, or some people go stainless if they have that money for it. But we also need to figure out the size of our fermenter. Now, what's going to be probably the common knowledge and the way you likely end up going is picking a fermenter to match the size of your still. If you have an 8-gallon fermenter, you're more than likely going to have an 8-gallon fermenter. That just makes sense. However, there's something called double batching, even triple batching, quadruple batching. We'll talk about it a little more in depth later, but the gist of it is let's say you have an 8-gallon still. Some people would choose to get a 16-gallon fermenter. That way they can do 2 batches in their still at the same time, no extra time for them, a little bit extra in ingredients obviously, but then you have 2 batches ready to go. People with time constraints, people that don't want to wait that 2 weeks for fermentation to be done, run it, then wait another 2 weeks. You can do it in one. Another small thing when you're looking for a fermenter is whether you want a flat bottom or a conical fermenter. This is pretty, I would say for the most part, irrelevant. It really doesn't matter that much. All you're really going to see with a conical fermenter is when yeast is finished working off, you have a crust of dead yeast cells that's going to be on the top of your bucket. Now, over time, that's going to start sinking and fall to the bottom. It's called a yeast bed. With flat, it's just going to stay at the bottom there. And then you as a distiller have to find a way to siphon the liquid, the alcohol in your fermenter vessel away from that dead yeast bed. Now, with conical fermenters, you're still going to have that dead yeast bed, but something in that design is going to have things clear faster. It's going to basically probably spiral down, just gravity. But essentially, you're probably looking maybe around a day shaved off of your fermentation time with a conical fermenter. If you can find one cheap enough, I would consider it. But I would say flat bottoms are going to be a lot more accessible to you. And from what I've seen, a fraction of the cost, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Maybe you'll have better luck than I did. Now, another thing that may come up is going to be a mash tun. What mash tuns do is they are a pot, just like the ones you'd put on a stove. What they should have, and most do, is a false bottom. And this is a perforated plate that's going to sit just a few inches from the base of that mash tun. That's going to allow it so grains, solid fruits, anything you have to cook for fermentation can be safely put in that pot and cooked without it reaching the bottom of that base and potentially scorching. Beer brewers are probably pretty used to this type of equipment, but if you are planning to work with grains, I would really highly recommend this. There are different ways around not using a mash tun, basically just pouring hot water over your grains and just hoping your temperatures are within their range. But you're going to lose a lot of the efficiency of your grains going this way. So I'd recommend getting a nice cooker, preferably one that has sort of a way to control the temperature, because grains are pretty particular in what they need to be for the best saccharification. Now, of course, we also need to pay attention to the size of our mash tun, and the same rules are going to apply. I would say more often than not, you're going to pick a mash tun that fits your fermenter size and your still size. But again, double batching exists. Grains are a pain for me, at least. I don't like cooking them that much. They're heavy and they're sticky and they get everywhere because I'm a slob, and I don't like doing it. So typically when I run my mash tun, I use double the capacity of my boiler, and I just get 2 runs done, separate them out into my fermentation vessel, and I have my 2 batches. One other thing we can look for in our mash tun is whether we want an electric or a flame heated vessel. A lot of these mash tuns on the cheaper side, more cost effective side, are going to be used with a propane stove. With electric mash tuns, you're looking at an increase in price. They're going to have usually tri-clamp ports down below past that false bottom, and they're a wonderful way to go. You have a little bit more control over your heat that way. You're going to be able to safely do things indoors. There's a few benefits to it if you have the extra funds for that. Now, big things in distilling are going to be our meters. Some of these are going to be essential. Some are going to be recommended, but not necessarily essential. A thermometer, technically not needed. I would highly, highly recommend you have some way to manage your fermentation. That fermentation, any sort of variable in your heat, if it goes too hot, if it goes too cold, and outside the optimal range of your yeast, things can just cause problems. I would say 9 out of 10 people I talk to with fermentation issues has something to do with heat. So we want to be able to manage that. There's a few different ways we can do that. Whether we're talking a floating thermometer, a little glass tube that's going to sit right in your liquid, in your fermentation vessel, and take a reading there. Could just be a meat thermometer with a long probe that can go in that bucket, or what I use personally is a stick-on digital thermometer. Tiny little sticker, put it right on my bucket. It's like $3, and I mean, it's not going to be like super precise, but it's going to be within a degree or two. It's going to be able to manage that, and that's all you really need. It's just to understand kind of where you're at. So there's different ways to go about that. Another important meter for fermentation is a hydrometer. So what a hydrometer does is measure your water content in your fermentation, your solution, as opposed to your alcohol and your sugars in there. That's going to give you a base reading and let you know exactly where your fermentation is estimated to be once it's distilled. So for your fermentation, you'll put things in a graduated cylinder or a test jar, and you'll drop your hydrometer in, and you'll get a gravity reading, it's called. You'll write that number down, come back a week later after everything's done fermenting, get a final gravity reading, and then you can run a calculation to see how much estimated alcohol by volume is in that solution. Now, on top of that being useful, one reason I love to use a hydrometer is because it's telling me whether things are working off or not. I'm going to take my starting gravity once my yeast pitch, and then what will happen is after 2 or 3 days, I'll take another reading. Let's say my number to start with is 1.090. After 3 days, if it's going up, maybe 1.060, I know things are converting. That means more alcohol is being created out of that solution, less water, so you get a lesser reading. So it's a surefire way to make sure your fermentation is working off. And if after a few days, if you're stuck at the same gravity reading you were seeing a few days prior, you know something's wrong with your fermentation, and you can begin to work with that, figure things out. So very helpful meter. Another meter that could be useful, use this maybe once or twice in distilling, is a pH meter. pH is another important part of fermentation, and we have to make sure it's sitting where it needs to sit. Things can go alkaline through a number of different reasons, which we will discuss later. Things could also be going a little bit acidic. Depending on what you're running, you might see that usually with fruits or grains. Sometimes if you're using enzymes, those can kind of mess up your pH balance. So Having a pH meter around, or even pH testing strips, would be a useful thing. Straining equipment is something I consider a must in distilling. Regardless of what you're running, whether it's solid grains or solid fruits, or you're going a sugar wash with a bunch of yeast and sugar particulate at the end of your fermentation vessel, one way or the other, you're going to have solids that need to be removed so you can carry the liquid over into your still and not run the risk of those solids burning and scorching, ruining your run. So we combat that with straining equipment. And there's a lot of different ways we can go about this. Now, one way we can go about this is a gravity-fed siphon, something like this. There's going to be a tube and then an inner tube. And we're going to pump, just like we're siphoning gas, you know, if you're a bad kid. We're going to have a hose attached to this end, and it's just going to be making sure that solution pumps through gravity, pumps through and into our boiler, or maybe another fermentation vessel if you just want to clear it that way. But we can remove the solids from the liquids with something like this. This isn't a catch-all. You can sometimes stick this too far into that bed of yeast and pull over some, but it'll do a good job of removing most of it. There are more effective methods in my opinion though. You could look at doing just a regular cheesecloth, or maybe just a brew bag. Now, cheesecloth is a very cost-effective method. What I do is, this is 2 square yards worth. Go ahead and roll it out, and then I just cut little squares. I cut enough of a square to go over the top of my bucket, and then I'll pin it in place with clothespins. Then what I can do is take another fermentation vessel, I always have 2 with me, and pour from one fermentation vessel into the other. Or again, you can do that with the top of your boiler. Just put this over the top, clothespin it down, repeat the process. The one downside of these is these are not machine washable. So you'll use them and they'll probably be pitched. Whereas a brewing bag is. This is made out of nylon, this is washable. And another perk of this is if you get the right size, we usually have the right sizes in stock, you're going to be able to line this bag within your fermentation vessel. And what you can do is pour in your solids, start your fermentation like normal, and all your solids are going to be sitting in this bag. Of course, after fermentation ends, we can simply bundle up that bag and remove all of our solids from our liquids in our fermentation vessel. Real simple, real easy to use. These run about $15 on the average market, and machine washable, so consider them. And here's my preferred method. This is a large funnel. They make them smaller. I love this one because it sits right over the collar of my boiler, and it'll have a pretty fine screen right in here. So I just put this right over my boiler, dump my fermentation on top, and it's going to remove all those solids. Take that basket out, wash it out with the hose, you know, good to go. This is pretty cheap as well. And then of course we could always look at some more commercial routes, something you would see with larger scale equipment. Transfer pumps are a great way. Sometimes they do get clogged. You usually need a big enough hose line through that pump to safely push everything through. But you know, if you're looking to spend a fair bit of money and kind of have sort of a professional equipment wise, you could look at a transfer pump. Temperature control is very important in fermentation. The problem is, in terms of equipment, there's not a whole lot out there. This is called a brew belt, and this is pretty cost effective, good way to keep your temperature up on your still. Let's say you're in the middle of Alaska and you're having trouble keeping your temperature where it needs to be for your yeast to properly ferment. This can actually strap around your bucket, plug into a standard wall socket, and it consistently keeps things at 80 degrees. And then another great way to keep the temperature of your fermentation up is through just a heating pad. I don't think they really have the temperature regulation that maybe a brew belt would, but it should keep you where it needs to stay. You could also look at making your own insulator. I've seen this done through that pool noodle foam. I don't really know exactly what type of foam that is. There's a lot of heat retardant wool and different things you can use. I've seen styrofoam before, interesting. And personally, what I've used in the past in my lab extraction days is something called Reflectix. This is going to run a little bit more money, but this is an extremely nice insulator. Now the problem with insulation is it can sometimes trap the heat. So if you're in sort of a strange environment where things can go maybe hot at the day, cold at night, and kind of switch around a little bit, you could be trapping some heat inside that fermenter and things can go out of whack. I'd recommend if you are using some sort of insulation system that you're checking those temperatures daily. Aside from that, our only real solutions towards temperature control that I'm aware of would just come from getting the right fermenter out the gate that could handle that. There's something known as jacketed fermenters. These are fermenters with an inner tank where all your liquid and everything will sit, and then an outer jacket around them. And that's where you can put in glycol to keep things cooler, or you can put in something like an oil and heat up that oil to keep things hotter. These are going to run a pretty penny, and for most cases, I wouldn't say you're really going to need them. I would say these other cheaper solutions are going to handle most of your temperature problems. When you really want to start looking into jacketed boilers is when you have huge vessels. Because what will happen is when you have tons of yeast in a huge fermentation vessel, this yeast will sort of create a chemical reaction itself. It'll start to heat itself up and kill itself off, basically. So that's when you're going to want to start to manage, and you might consider that jacketed vessel to just consistently cool or heat things up as you need. And with that said, what goes along with that is a PID. PID is a device connects to a K-couple that connects to a wire into a control box, and you can set temperatures on it. Some of these insulated fermenters might have this equipped already. You might have to build your own. If you can manage to get your hands on one or build one yourself, this can do a really good job of keeping things either cooler or hotter, depending on what you need. Now let's talk a little bit about fermentation methods. Now, with fermentation, it's a pretty standard process. There's variations here and there, but for the most part, you have what's called traditional. I wrote it in parentheses because it's definitely not the traditional way to ferment. This wasn't how things started. This wasn't what people did, but it's by far the most common, and it's just closed fermentation. A bucket with something on top to stop oxygen from entering the bucket. Other than that, you can also look at open fermentation methods. Now, this would be that same fermentation vessel, and you keep the top open. Sometimes people put a cloth over it. I don't really know the benefit of open fermentation. This is what pioneer moonshiners used to do a lot of. I have heard that it increases your flavor and characteristic of that spirit by having all that wild bacteria, wild yeast kind of sit in that bucket over time through open fermentation. So maybe play around, guys. I mean, it's just as simple to do closed as open. Maybe try one batch one way, another one the other way, and see if you really notice a difference. To proceed further, we can also look at sub-methods for these fermentation types. One we've already talked about. We talked about double batching. Cold crash is also a method used in fermentation. What it essentially means is, remember, we're putting usually boiling hot ingredients into our fermentation vessel. Whether we're cooking our grains or fruits and we have all that boiling water, or we need to put boiling water into our sugar wash to dissolve the sugar, we're going to end up with a really hot solution. And most yeast on the market aren't going to be able to handle that hot of temperature, that high of temperature. So we need to let things cool. We can do this naturally, or we can do this through something called cold crashing. One way I like to do this is, let's say I have an 8-gallon fermenter. That's a 6.5-gallon batch size. I'll pour in my raw ingredients, and then I use about 4 gallons of boiling water. And then I'll use the other 2.5-gallon capacity that I have in my fermenter vessel. That'll be my cold water. Otherwise, you can just wait overnight. Sometimes I'll start my fermentation maybe 9, 10 p.m. and leave it just a crack open. I go to sleep, and when I wake up, it's right around where it needs to be for my yeast. And then another thing, like we talked about, is insulated vessels. An inner vessel that holds your material, and then an outer vessel to either cool or heat it, depending on what you're doing. It could be beneficial. In most cases, I would say it's not. I usually recommend it to people, like let's say you're in Arizona. Well, in the middle of summer, you're probably going to have trouble keeping things cooled down in your fermentation vessel. Maybe you have a temperature controlled area that you can put it in and keep things right. But if you think you have the potential to spike in your location with your temperatures, consider going out the gate with a jacketed vessel, saving yourself a lot of trouble. The last section I want to discuss here today is not really the basics or figuring stuff out. It's after you've fermented. We're going to go over stuck fermentations. What a stuck fermentation means is there could be a variety of different things that go wrong in that fermentation to basically stop it from working. It can be pH-based, temperature-based, different things. So if you're at a point where you are stuck on a fermentation, or maybe you're at a point where you're trying to learn all this, and when you do your first fermentation, it gets stuck. Well, let's go back to this section, go ahead and review this, save this in a playlist for later, and let's talk a little bit about stuck fermentations and how to help. Now, as I mentioned, I would say most stuck fermentations I see are temperature dependent. If you're too cold, that's one thing and a lot easier of a solution. What happens when yeast gets too cold is it goes dormant. It basically wants to sleep. It can't properly produce that energy it needs, and so it'll just gently snooze off. And it's a pretty easy fix. All we're going to do is just heat that bucket back up. The best way that I found to do this is create a starter. Now, what a starter is we're going to have, let's just say, a graduated cylinder like this. You can even use like a jar. We're going to fill maybe about halfway up with some warm water. We're going to want that water to be as close to the temperature our yeast is asking for as possible. And then what we'll do is we'll just do maybe a teaspoon or so of yeast and maybe a tablespoon or so of sugar. We're going to put that all in this test jar, your vessel. You're going to give it a nice stir, nice shake, and it'll be a good sign if things start to fizz up on that. That's a starter. That is the essence of fermentation in minuscule form. And all you'll do is once that starts foaming up, you're going to pour it over the top of your bucket, and then as best as you can, with how much room you're going to have in that fermentation vessel, try to pump in that hot water and get it back up to temperature. Or, use a heating pad, use a brew belt, something like that. This is again why a hydrometer is a very useful device. If things get stuck and you're too cold, I'd recommend taking a gravity reading, do your starter, come back in about a day and see if those numbers continue to go down. That'll be a good sign. If things get too hot in your fermentation vessel, it's unfortunately a different story. There's nothing else you can really do but put fresh yeast into that vessel and hope things kick off again. Now, before we talk about fruit, let's talk about pH, which is another killer and creator of stuck fermentations. When things get too alkaline in a solution, that yeast, it produces too much of a toxic environment for that yeast, and it can't function correctly. So it's going to start to kill itself off. Now, pH is going to be something where you have to be active on. If you catch it ahead of time, there are solutions. If that wash has been sitting there, become too alkaline, you are unfortunately going to have to start all over on your fermentation. I hope that doesn't happen. There's really not too much of a way to tell, other than I guess you could use a pH testing strip and see how far along you are. I still don't think that'd be very effective. It'd really just be a gamble. You would try to bring that pH level down, see what happens, see if it ferments, see if it keeps going the next day. If your wash is blue or green, that is definitely alkaline, and do not use that. Throw it out. As far as fixing our pH goes, there's a few different things we can do. My favorite method is to try to use all natural ingredients if possible. If you're wanting to decrease your pH, use lemons and limes. And if you're trying to bring your pH up, which really shouldn't be the case, maybe with rums it might become something, use baking soda. Baking soda for up, lemons, limes for down. You have to use a lot of limes and a lot of lemons to do that. Baking soda, you have to use a very small amount, so it's a little bit tricky. Or if you don't really want to play that guessing game or want to worry about ruining things more, you can pick up something called 5-star pH stabilizer. You might consider a starter after you fix your pH as well. And to that point, a big cause of pH going out of whack is going to be fruit. Citrusy fruit is probably the biggest culprit I've seen of this. Same with grains. Not so much the grains, but if you're using powder enzymes to convert the starches in your grains to sugars, they're going to require a specific pH balance. So you're going to want them out of pH, the optimal range, to get those enzymes working effectively as they should, and then you'll have to bring it back down. So if you do that process right, you're not going to have a problem with pH, but sometimes I can get screwed up and you bring it down too much or it stays too high and can ruin things. So how fruit mashes get stuck is outside of that alkaline or pH differential. What can happen is that most fruit has wild yeast living inside of it, and it can fight with the yeast you're putting on top for that fermentation vessel and fight for dominance. Sometimes they end up killing each other off. When this happens, a great way to combat that is going to be using something called pectic enzyme. This is an enzyme found naturally in fruits like apples, and it's just very healthy for the fruit. So it's going to probably recommend using that starter once more and then putting in a little bit of that pectin on top and just helping things continue to go. I'd say another thing that I see occasionally with stuck fermentations has to do with yeast nutrient. What can happen is sometimes people get a pack of yeast not realizing that it already has nutrients built in, and you don't need to add nutrients on top. If you do that, you can create an alkaline environment, and again, you'll see that with maybe a blue or a green wash. Again, if this happens, it's all about time. If you catch it in time, go ahead and try that starter, get that pH back down to normal, see what happens. That's what really sucks with stuck fermentations. There are a little bit of play there. You can fix things, but in a lot of scenarios, you end up staying stuck. And you can either choose to run with the alcohol you already have converted. You might have 5% alcohol by volume in that fermenter by the time you get stuck, and you can consider running that and getting that 5% out, or pitching, starting over, trying again. Guys, I don't know if you can tell from this video, I am about to pass out. I am so tired. So if this wasn't up to my standard, I'll be disappointed in myself. I hope I did an okay job of explaining things and providing solutions and maybe helping you along your fermentation journey. I would really like to hear some feedback on the series and what you guys are thinking. I want to hear how you're liking the series. If they're too boring, let me know and I'll stop doing them. If it's something where you're gaining the knowledge from and you want to continue to see them, I'd love to hear that feedback. You know, you guys really drive me on these. I'm pretty camera shy. I'm very isolated. I don't really spend time out of my room once I'm home from work. So it's a little bit of a weird environment to be in, but I do love doing these videos for you, and I love hearing how I can do better or different videos that you guys would like to see. It really drives me to hear from you guys. So thank you for watching. Thank you for commenting, liking, subscribing, just letting this place thrive. Anyone who's purchased from our shop, thank you guys so much. Appreciate everyone. And looking forward to the next video, guys. Peace.